Flames danced on the walls of the wooden cabin, while outside a blizzard raged, mercilessly throwing snow against the foggy window panes. Jack Forrester stood by the fireplace, thoughtfully stirring a thick stew in a pot. For the past 5 years, he had worked as a forest ranger in the Blue Ridge National Reserve. And for just as long, he had been trying to forget his past life in New York. A sudden sound from the porch, something between a scrape and a muffled groan, yanked him from his thoughts. His hand instinctively reached for the rifle hanging on the wall. 9 years in the police force had developed reflexes that didn't fade with time. Jack slowly opened the door, allowing cold air and snow to invade the warmth of the house. At first, he saw nothing but the white lace of the blizzard, but then his gaze dropped lower. On the wooden steps of the porch lay a large lynx, bloodied with heavy, intermittent breathing. Its amber eyes, full of pain and fear, looked directly at him. And in that gaze was not only animal wariness, but something almost human, a plea. Jack slowly lowered his rifle. It was a female Canadian lynx, a species rarely seen in these parts and listed in the Red Book of Endangered Species. "God, what happened to you?" Jack muttered, carefully leaning down. The lynx tried to crawl away, but strength was leaving her. On her hind leg, there was a deep wound. It looked like a poacher's trap. Just a moment ago, he had been ready to defend himself from a predator, but now he felt only pity and anger toward those who had done this. The lynx stretched her neck, making a quiet but insistent sound, as if trying to say something. Jack carefully lifted the injured animal, prepared for her to react aggressively due to the pain. But the lynx only whimpered quietly. He carried her into the cabin, quickly making a place near the fireplace with old blankets. After settling her there, the lynx made that same sound again, but now more insistently. Something in her behavior made Jack pause. He knew enough about wild animals to understand something wasn't right. He put on his jacket and went back out to the porch, peering carefully at the snow-covered trail the lynx had made. 10 meters away, under a low fir tree, he found the answer. A small lynx kitten, trembling from the cold, but alive. The kitten mewed softly when it saw the human, trying to appear fierce despite its pitiful condition. "Oh, hell," muttered Jack, understanding the situation he found himself in. It was one thing to provide first aid to an injured wild animal, and quite another to essentially become a guardian for its baby. But there was no choice. He carefully picked up the kitten, feeling the small heart beating rapidly under the thick spotted fur. Returning to the cabin, Jack placed the kitten next to its mother. The female lynx immediately began licking her baby, making quiet, soothing sounds. "Need to give you names," he mused aloud while preparing the first aid kit. "You'll be Shadow." He nodded to the adult lynx. "And the little one? Scout." The next few hours, Jack spent treating Shadow's wound. He wasn't a veterinarian, but had experience with first aid and enough knowledge of anatomy to understand. The wound was serious, but not fatal. The trap had crushed the bone, but the main arteries remained intact. The animal had lost a lot of blood, but it seemed the worst was behind her. "Strange that you came here," Jack said, applying a bandage. "Wild animals usually avoid humans, especially when injured." The lynx looked at him with her amber eyes, which now showed not only pain, but something that seemed almost trust. "Impossible," thought Jack. "It's just a survival instinct and shock from blood loss." But still, there was something in that gaze that made him feel as if a connection had already been established between them. When the early treatment was finished, Jack stood up to prepare food for himself and his new guests. Scout seemed to have already adapted and even began to carefully explore the nearest space, constantly returning to his mother. Jack found meat in the freezer that he had planned to cook tomorrow, but was now happy to give to his unexpected guests. After thawing and cutting it into pieces, he first offered it to Shadow. The lynx sniffed but didn't eat, instead pushing the meat towards Scout. The kitten eagerly pounced on the food. "Good mother," Jack remarked with respect. "Child first, then you." While Scout ate, Jack cut more meat and offered it to Shadow again. This time, she cautiously accepted the food, not taking her eyes off the human. When both had eaten, Jack sat in the old armchair by the fire with his own bowl of soup and began to think about the next steps. Tomorrow, he would contact the reserve rangers, report the poacher's trap. But what to do with the lynxes? Shadow wouldn't be able to move for at least a few weeks, possibly months. "Looks like you're my guests for a long time," he said to the animals, who, tired and fed, were already dozing by the fireplace. Jack stood up to add wood to the fire. The lynx opened her eyes, watching his every movement, but without fear, just attentiveness. The snowstorm was still raging outside the window, but inside the cabin, it was warm. And for the first time in many years, Jack didn't feel alone in this wilderness. Morning greeted Jack with unusual sounds in his typically quiet cabin. Soft purring mixed with the light creaking of the wooden floor under the paws of a small explorer. He opened his eyes and saw Scout, who carefully, but with enormous curiosity, was examining every corner of the room. Shadow lay in the same place by the fireplace, but her gaze was attentive, watching every movement of her little one. "Good morning, uninvited guests," muttered Jack, slowly rising from his bed. Scout froze at the sound of his voice, then quickly returned to his mother. Jack approached the window. The blizzard had subsided, leaving behind a fairy tale winter landscape. Pine trees bent under the weight of snow, and the sky was unnaturally blue, as if washed by yesterday's storm. "Need to call Mark," he said to himself, picking up the satellite phone. The chief ranger of the reserve needed to know about the poacher's trap and the injured lynx. "Jack, what happened?" Mark's sudden concerned voice came through the receiver after several rings. "I have guests," replied Jack, watching the lynxes. "A female Canadian lynx with a kitten. The female is injured by a poacher's trap. I provided first aid, but..." "Wait, you've taken in a wild lynx? In your house?" Mark didn't hide his surprise. "She came on her own. Yesterday evening during the blizzard. I couldn't just leave them to die." Jack noticed how Shadow listened to his voice, tilting her head to the side, as if she understood the conversation. "I see. You should know this is problematic from a protocol standpoint. We need to transport her to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center." Mark's voice became official. "And the sooner, the better." Jack looked at the injured lynx, who was licking her little one. "Listen, Mark, the road is still snowed in. It's at least 2 days before she can be transported. And right now she's better off staying warm and calm." A pause on the other end. "All right, but you know not to get attached, right? These are wild animals." "I know," Jack replied, although somewhere inside, he felt it was already too late. After finishing the conversation, he started his morning tasks. First, checking Shadow's wound. She allowed him to approach, only quietly growling when he touched the damaged leg. "No inflammation. That's good," Jack muttered, carefully changing the bandage. "But complete recovery will take a long time." He prepared fresh meat for the lynxes, taking supplies from the freezer. However, my supplies aren't endless, he said aloud, realizing that he would soon have to go hunting. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. He would hunt to feed wild predators in his home. After breakfast, Jack decided to check the area around the cabin. Dressing warmly and taking his rifle, he headed to where he had found the lynx's tracks the previous night. The fresh snow perfectly preserved Shadow's journey. He followed her path back almost a kilometer until he reached the place where it all happened. Under an old spruce tree in a small depression, he found the trap. Old, rusty, but with razor-sharp teeth, now stained with dried blood. The lynx had somehow broken free, perhaps when the snowstorm began and the chain securing the trap loosened. Sons of bitches, Jack cursed, carefully activating and deactivating the trap mechanism. He knew such models, long banned, but still popular among poachers due to their cheapness and effectiveness. Jack wrapped the trap in a cloth and put it in his backpack. Now, it was evidence. He expanded his search radius, suspecting that where there was one trap, there might be others. Indeed, in less than an hour, he found 3 more, all of the same type, all freshly set. Returning home with 4 traps in his backpack, Jack couldn't help but wonder who might have set them. Poaching in the National Reserve was rare. The fines were too high and surveillance too vigilant. But for the last few months, he had noticed strange sounds at night that made him think someone was regularly violating the reserve's boundaries. Opening the cabin door, he encountered an unusual scene. Scout was sitting on his bed, fascinated by examining an old photograph that he had probably pulled from the nightstand. The photo showed Jack in police uniform standing next to his former partner. "Hey, little one, that's not a toy." Jack approached and carefully took the photograph. Scout didn't run away, just looked at him with his clear eyes, which read almost childlike offense. Then the lynx kitten jumped off the bed and returned to his mother, who had been watching the situation the entire time. "He's curious, your little one," Jack said to Shadow, putting the photograph on the table. The lynx raised her head as if agreeing. After lunch, Jack called Mark again, telling him about his findings. 4 traps? Damn, that's serious. Mark's voice became tense. "Nothing else suspicious?" "No, but I'll continue searching tomorrow. I think there might be more," Jack replied, thinking. "And one more thing. Could you check who has hunting permits in the adjacent territories? Maybe someone accidentally or not accidentally is entering the reserve." "I'll do it. And about your guests. How are they?" Jack looked at the lynxes. Scout was already asleep, curled up against his mother's warm side. Shadow wasn't sleeping. Her amber eyes looked directly at Jack, reading a mixture of wariness and trust. "They're adapting," he answered. "Scout seems to already consider my cabin his territory. And Shadow, she lets me approach and change her bandage." "Jack, remember what we talked about. These are wild animals. They need to return to the wild as soon as possible." I know, Jack replied. But somewhere deep inside, he was no longer sure he wanted that. Evening descended on the reserve quickly, as happens in winter. Jack lit the fireplace and sat by the fire with a book, occasionally glancing at his unusual companions. The lynxes slept, but Shadow periodically opened her eyes, checking the surroundings. "You know," he said quietly, as if more to himself than to the lynx, "I was wounded once too. Not by a trap, of course." He absently rubbed the scar on his chest. "The bullet hit my bulletproof vest, but still broke my ribs. That was my last day in the police force, and my last day in the city." He stared at the flames, orange like the lynx's eyes. Sometimes wounds that aren't visible take longer to heal. Shadow looked at him, unblinking, as if she understood. Perhaps, thought Jack, in the wild, there are also invisible scars, territory taken away, prey that couldn't be caught, cubs that couldn't be protected. Before going to bed, Jack checked the doors and windows, an old police reflex that now took on new meaning. He was protecting not only himself, but also two new members of his small world. Lying in bed, he looked one last time at the lynxes peacefully sleeping by the dying fire. "Good night, Shadow. Good night, Scout," he whispered, and in these words was a promise he would not dare formulate louder. "I will protect you." 3 days had passed, and Jack's cabin had transformed into an unusual pocket of wilderness within 4 walls. Scout had adapted so well that he began to view the furniture as his personal playground, while Shadow, though still cautious, now allowed Jack not only to change her bandage, but occasionally to stroke her fur as well. "You know, your paw is healing remarkably fast," Jack observed, finishing his morning examination. "But it's still at least a few weeks until full recovery." The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Mark's name lit up on the display. "Jack, I have information about the hunting permits," came the voice without preliminaries. 5 local landowners have legal permits for the territories adjacent to the reserve. But one name caught my attention: Griffin. "Griffin?" Jack frowned. "As in the Griffin family that owns half the county?" "The very same. Richard Griffin and his son Thomas. They've been renewing their permits religiously for 10 years, always requesting the zones closest to our northern border." Jack walked to the map of the reserve hanging on the wall. He knew the Griffins by reputation: old money, big influence, and a penchant for hunting trophies. "The traps I found were in the northeastern sector," Jack said, tracing the area with his finger. "Less than a mile from their permitted territory." "Could be a coincidence," Mark remarked, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it either. "I'm going to check the area more thoroughly today," Jack decided. "The storm has cleared, and I need to see if there are more traps." After hanging up, Jack began preparing for the expedition. He packed his backpack with equipment, a first aid kit, and enough provisions for a full day in the forest. When he reached for his rifle, he noticed Shadow watching him intently. "I'll be back before dark," Jack said, surprising himself by feeling the need to explain his absence to the lynx. "There's fresh meat in the bowl." He was just about to leave when Scout suddenly dashed to the door and stood there, looking back at Jack expectantly. "You want to come with me?" Jack asked incredulously. The lynx kitten pawed at the door and meowed. Jack looked at Shadow, who had risen to her feet, still favoring the injured leg, but able to stand. She approached her cub, and for a moment, Jack thought she would discipline him, call him back. Instead, she nudged Scout gently toward Jack. "Are you giving me permission?" Jack was baffled. In his years working with wildlife, he'd never seen anything like this. Wild animals, especially predators, didn't normally entrust their young to humans. Shadow's amber eyes held Jack's gaze steadily. "All right then," he conceded, opening the door. "But you stay close, Scout. This isn't a game." The crisp winter air filled Jack's lungs as he stepped outside. The world was pristine, a canvas of white broken only by the dark trunks of pines and firs. Scout bounded ahead, his spotted coat a stark contrast against the snow, but never ventured more than 20 yards from Jack. Together, they headed northeast, toward the area where Jack had found the first traps. To his surprise, Scout proved to be an excellent companion, curious but obedient. occasionally darting off to investigate a scent before returning to Jack's side. After an hour of hiking, they reached the edge of a clearing where Jack had found 2 of the traps. He was methodically searching the area when a sharp, insistent meow drew his attention. Scout stood about 50 feet away, pawing at the snow and looking back at Jack urgently. "What is it, boy?" Jack approached, scanning the ground cautiously. Then he saw it, just the edge of a metal jaw poking through the snow. Another trap, expertly hidden. "Good catch, Scout," Jack praised, carefully disarming the mechanism. "You've got better eyes than I do." The Lynx kitten seemed to understand the compliment, sitting proudly as Jack bagged the evidence. By midday, with Scout's unexpected help, Jack had found 3 more traps, all newer models, all professionally set. This wasn't the work of casual poachers. This was systematic. As they continued deeper into the forest, the terrain became rougher. They were now well beyond the usual patrol routes, approaching the northern boundary of the reserve. Jack checked his GPS. They were less than a quarter mile from Griffin property. Suddenly, Scout froze. His ears flattened and his body tensed. Jack immediately dropped to a crouch, reading the lynx's body language. Something had alarmed the young predator. That's when Jack heard it, the distant but distinct sound of an engine. In this part of the reserve, there shouldn't be any vehicles. "Come on," he whispered to Scout, moving carefully toward the sound. Staying concealed among the trees, they approached a narrow, unmarked trail. Fresh tracks in the snow indicated recent activity. A heavy-duty vehicle with off-road tires. Jack took out his binoculars and scanned the direction the tracks led. About half a mile ahead, partially hidden by the terrain, was what appeared to be a small hunting cabin. It wasn't on any of the reserve maps. "Interesting," Jack murmured. "Very interesting." As he watched, a dark SUV emerged from behind the cabin. Even from this distance, Jack could make out the Griffin Hunting Lodge logo on its side. So the Griffins are making themselves at home in the reserve? Jack took out his phone and captured. Scout suddenly tensed again, making a low sound in his throat. Jack immediately sensed the shift in the lynx's demeanor, from alert to alarmed. The sound of a breaking branch behind them confirmed they weren't alone. Jack turned slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward his rifle. Through the trees, he caught a glimpse of movement, a human figure in camouflage. "Time to go," Jack whispered to Scout, who seemed to understand perfectly, crouching low and ready to move. They retreated silently, using the trees for cover. Jack's police training kicked in. Move quietly, stay downwind, leave no obvious trail. Scout proved remarkably adept at stealth, his natural camouflage helping him blend with the patchy snow and shadows. After putting some distance between themselves and the observer, Jack picked up Scout. The lynx was light, barely 20 pounds, and waded through a shallow, icy stream, erasing their tracks. "Smart boy," Jack praised quietly when they reached the other bank. "You alerted me just in time." The journey back to the cabin seemed twice as long, with Jack constantly checking behind them. When they finally reached the clearing surrounding his home, he felt a wave of relief wash over him. Shadow was waiting on the porch, an unlikely sentinel. She had clearly been watching for their return, her injured leg now bearing more weight than the day before. Scout bounded up to her, and the two touched noses in greeting. "We've made an interesting discovery today," Jack told Shadow as they all went inside. He picked up his satellite phone and dialed Mark immediately. "We have a situation," Jack said when Mark answered. "I found 3 more traps, and there's an unauthorized cabin in the northeast sector. Griffin's vehicle was there. Are you sure? Mark's voice was tense. Positive. Got photos, but there's more. Someone was watching me. I think they followed us for at least a mile. There was a long pause on the other end. This is escalating, Jack. These aren't just poachers. They're organized and they're bold. The question is why, Jack replied, looking at the lynxes. Scout had curled up next to Shadow, exhausted from the day's adventure. Why take such risks? The fines for poaching in a national reserve could bankrupt even the griffins. I'll look deeper into the griffins, Mark promised. In the meantime, be careful. If they're willing to set illegal traps in a federal reserve, who knows what else they're capable of? After hanging up, Jack secured the cabin, checking locks, drawing curtains, and placing his rifle within easy reach. The encounter in the forest had left him uneasy. As night fell, Jack sat at his small desk, pinning photos to a map and connecting them with red string, an old detective habit from his police days. The picture that emerged was troubling. A systematic intrusion into the northeastern section of the reserve, with the Griffin property serving as a potential base of operations. What are they after? Jack wondered aloud. The reserve had strict limits on hunting, only specific species during specific seasons with proper permits. The lynx population, already endangered, was completely off limits. He looked at Shadow and Scout, who were watching him work with curious eyes. Is it you? Is that what they're after? Lynx pelts? The thought made his stomach turn. Rare animal pelts could fetch astronomical prices on the black market. Jack was about to turn in for the night when a sound outside made him freeze. The faint crunch of snow under a heavy boot. Shadow's ears perked up, and Scout immediately darted under the bed, his instincts telling him to hide. Jack dimmed the oil lamp and moved silently to the window, carefully peering out from behind the curtain. In the moonlight, he could make out a figure at the edge of the clearing, watching the cabin. "We've got company," Jack whispered, reaching for his rifle. Jack moved silently through his cabin, every sense heightened. The figure outside remained motionless, a dark silhouette against the moonlit snow. Shadow crouched by the window, her amber eyes fixed on the intruder, while Scout remained hidden beneath the bed. "Don't move," Jack whispered to the lynxes as he slowly opened the back door, careful not to make a sound. Years of police training guided his movements as he circled around the cabin, using the trees for cover. The cold air bit at his face as he approached the figure from behind. His rifle was ready, but he hoped he wouldn't need to use it. Just 20 feet away now, Jack could make out more details. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing expensive hunting gear. "That's far enough," Jack called out firmly, raising his rifle. "Turn around slowly, hands where I can see them." The figure stiffened but complied, raising gloved hands and turning to face Jack. In the moonlight, Jack recognized the sharp features and arrogant posture of Thomas Griffin, the son of the county's most powerful family. "Easy with that thing, Forrester," Thomas said, his voice casual despite the rifle pointed at his chest. "Just out for a night walk. 3 miles from the nearest road? On reserve property?" Jack kept his tone even. "You're trespassing, Griffin." Thomas smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Am I? Boundaries get so confusing in the dark. My family's property is just north of here." "Your family's property is 5 miles north," Jack corrected. "You know that as well as I do." Thomas shrugged, seemingly unconcerned by the confrontation. "Dad sent me to check on you, actually. Heard you found some old traps. Nasty business, poaching." The casual mention of the traps, information that hadn't been made public, confirmed Jack's suspicions. The Griffins were involved. "Your concern is noted," Jack replied coldly. "Now head back to your land. Next time, use a phone if you want to check on me." Thomas held Jack's gaze for a long moment before nodding. "Nice pets you've got, by the way. Quite the animal lover, aren't you?" Jack kept his expression neutral, but inwardly he tensed. How did Griffin know about the lynxes? "Don't worry," Thomas continued, reading Jack's reaction. "Your secret's safe, for now." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the forest. Jack remained outside until he was certain Griffin was gone, then returned to the cabin. Shadow met him at the door, her eyes questioning. "We have a problem," Jack told her, securing the door behind him. "They know about you." Jack called Mark immediately, despite the late hour. "Griffin's son was just here," Jack explained, pacing the small cabin. "He knows about the traps we found, and worse, he knows about the lynxes." "That's concerning," Mark replied, fully awake now. "But maybe not surprising. The Griffin estate shares a long border with the reserve. They probably have eyes everywhere." "There's more to this than poaching," Jack insisted. "You need to look deeper into the Griffins. Their business interests, recent land acquisitions, everything." "I'll see what I can find," Mark promised. "In the meantime, I've been thinking about your guests. It's been several days now." "Protocol says they're not ready," Jack interrupted, looking at Shadow, who was listening intently to the conversation. "Shadow's leg is still healing, and now we know there are people actively hunting lynxes in the area. The rehab center can't protect them like I can." There was a long pause. "All right," Mark finally conceded, "but we're bending a lot of rules here, Jack. Be careful." After the call, Jack found himself unable to sleep. He spread maps of the area across his desk, studying the boundaries of the reserve and the surrounding properties. The Griffin lands encompassed nearly 5,000 acres to the north, including several old mining claims that had been in the family for generations. "What are you really after, Griffin?" Jack muttered, tracing the property lines with his finger. Something wasn't adding up. He was startled from his thoughts by a gentle pressure against his leg. Shadow had approached silently and now sat beside him, her amber eyes studying the maps as if she understood what they represented. "Sorry if I woke you," Jack said softly, reaching down to stroke her fur, a gesture that would have been unthinkable just days ago. Shadow didn't flinch from his touch. Instead, she pressed her head against his hand, a gesture of trust that made Jack's throat tighten unexpectedly. "We're in this together now, aren't we?" he asked, and the lynx blinked slowly in what seemed like agreement. Morning came with fresh snow and renewed determination. Jack contacted several former colleagues from his police days, asking for discreet background checks on the Griffin family and their businesses. If they were involved in something illegal, there would be a trail. While waiting for responses, Jack decided to check on the unauthorized cabin they'd discovered. This time, however, he went alone. Despite Scout's protests, the young lynx had positioned himself stubbornly by the door. Jack insisted both lynxes remain at the cabin. "I need you to protect home base," he told them, feeling only slightly foolish for speaking to the animals as if they understood every word. But the way Shadow moved to sit beside Scout, as if accepting the assignment, made Jack wonder just how much they did comprehend. The forest was quiet that morning, the fresh snow muffling all sound. Jack moved carefully, taking an indirect route to avoid leaving an obvious trail. When he reached the vantage point overlooking the cabin, he settled in to observe. For 2 hours, there was no activity. The cabin appeared deserted, though fresh tire tracks indicated recent visits. Just as Jack was considering moving closer for a better look, his satellite phone vibrated. It was one of his former partners, Lisa Chen, now working in financial crimes. "Your Griffin family is interesting," Lisa said without preamble. "They've been buying up land around the reserve for the past 3 years through various shell companies, and they've recently partnered with North Star Mining Corporation." "Mining?" Jack frowned. "There's nothing worth mining around here. The old claims played out decades ago." "Not according to the geological surveys North Star commissioned last year," Lisa replied. "They found something big, judging by the capital they're raising." The pieces began to fall into place. The reserve blocks access to the richest part of the old mining territory, Jack realized. If they want to develop it, they'd need to redraw the reserve boundaries, Lisa finished, which would require proving the land isn't being properly managed or protected. "Like showing evidence of rampant poaching," Jack added. "Classic corporate playbook," Lisa agreed. "I'll keep digging. Be careful, Jack. People have disappeared for less when billions are at stake." After the call, Jack moved closer to the cabin, now understanding what was at stake. This wasn't just about illegal hunting. It was about undermining the entire reserve for corporate gain. Using his binoculars, he could now see details he'd missed before. Security cameras disguised as birdhouses. A satellite dish hidden under camouflage netting, and most disturbingly, what appeared to be animal pelts hanging inside, visible through a partially curtained window. Jack documented everything with his camera, careful to stay out of sight of the security systems. As he was about to retreat, a vehicle approached, the same SUV he'd seen before, but now accompanied by a larger truck. Staying low, Jack watched as 3 men exited the vehicles. 2 he didn't recognize, but the third was Richard Griffin himself, impeccably dressed even in the wilderness. They entered the cabin, leaving the truck unattended. Taking a calculated risk, Jack circled around to approach the truck from the blind side. The vehicle was locked, but through the windows, he could see crates stacked in the back. One was partially open, revealing the gleam of metal. More traps. Jack retreated, moving swiftly but silently back through the forest. He needed to get this information to... The door opened before he reached it, and Shadow emerged, her movements agitated. She made a guttural sound Jack hadn't heard before, a warning. "What is it?" Jack asked, immediately alert. His answer came in the form of an excited meow as Scout bounded past Shadow and raced to Jack, then immediately turned and headed for the trees to the east of the cabin, looking back expectantly. "You want me to follow you?" Jack asked, shouldering his rifle. Scout meowed again, more urgently. Jack looked at Shadow, who had moved to stand beside him. "Lead the way," he told Scout, and the young lynx took off at a pace Jack could follow. For nearly half a mile, Scout led him through the forest, occasionally stopping to ensure Jack was keeping up. Finally, the lynx halted at the edge of a small ravine and looked down. Following Scout's gaze, Jack discovered what had alarmed the lynxes: a freshly dug pit covered with branches and snow, a rudimentary but effective trap large enough for a human. And beyond it, hidden among the trees, was a hunter's blind with a clear view of Jack's cabin. Someone had been watching him, and they had prepared for his capture. Jack studied the hunter's blind with cold anger. The careful positioning, the clear sightlines to his cabin, this was professional work. Someone had been monitoring his movements, perhaps for days, and the pit trap suggested they were ready to move beyond observation. "Good job, Scout," Jack said, scratching behind the young lynx's ears. The animal purred briefly before returning his attention to the surroundings. ears constantly pivoting to catch any sound. Jack took pictures of everything: the blind, the trap, the boot prints still visible in patches of undisturbed snow. This was evidence, not just of trespassing, but of clear intent to harm. As he worked, a plan began forming in his mind. If the Griffins wanted to play games of cat and mouse, they'd soon learn he wasn't typical prey. Back at the cabin, Jack called Mark and detailed everything he'd learned: the mining connection, the surveillance of his home, the trap. "This is serious," Mark's voice was grave. "I'll contact the federal authorities. This goes beyond local jurisdiction now." "The wheels of justice turn slowly," Jack replied. "And meanwhile, they're still out there, setting traps and hunting protected species. We need to build a stronger case." "What are you suggesting?" Mark asked cautiously. "I'm going to set up surveillance of my own. If they're watching me, I'll watch them back. Document everything." There was hesitation on the other end. "Be careful, Jack. These people are dangerous and well-connected." "I've dealt with worse," Jack said, the memory of his final days on the police force flashing through his mind. "Besides, I has help." He looked at Shadow and Scout, who were sitting nearby, watching him with intelligent eyes. In just a week, the injured Lynx and her kitten had become more than unexpected guests. They were partners. After the call, Jack got to work. From a locked chest under his bed, he retrieved equipment from his past life: a set of compact trail cameras with night vision, motion sensors, and a directional microphone. Tools he'd used for stakeouts that he never thought he'd need again. Shadow watched his preparations with interest, occasionally sniffing the equipment. Her wound was healing remarkably well. She now put weight on the injured leg, moving with only a slight limp. "Ready for some field work?" Jack asked her, holding out a small harness he'd fashioned from spare leather straps. Shadow sniffed it suspiciously, but allowed him to place it around her body. The harness held a tiny camera, virtually invisible amid her thick fur. "Perfect," Jack said, stepping back to admire his handiwork. "Now we can see what you see." Over the next 3 days, Jack implemented his plan. By day, he and the Lynxes patrolled the forest, focusing on the areas where they'd found traps. Shadow proved to be an exceptional tracker, her sense of smell leading them to 4 more traps that Jack would have missed. Each one was carefully documented and disabled. The camera on Shadow's harness captured everything, providing a unique perspective that conventional surveillance couldn't achieve. At night, Jack reviewed the footage, building a detailed map of the Griffin's activities in the reserve. Scout, too, proved his worth. The young Lynx seemed to have an uncanny ability to detect when humans had recently passed through an area. He would freeze, nose high, then lead Jack to signs of intrusion: a broken branch, a cigarette butt, a boot print hidden beneath fallen leaves. On the 4th day, their vigilance paid off. The trail cameras Jack had positioned around the unauthorized cabin captured Thomas Griffin and 2 men unloading crates from a truck. The directional microphone picked up fragments of their conversation. "Need at least a dozen more specimens before the inspection. Ranger is becoming a problem. Take care of it after the commissioner's visit." Jack sent the footage to Mark immediately. "This is exactly what we needed," Mark confirmed. "The commissioner's visit they mentioned, that must be Commissioner Harding from the Department of Interior. He's scheduled to tour the reserve next week to evaluate its status." "The timing fits," Jack agreed. "Create enough evidence of mismanagement, then have a convenient solution ready when the commissioner arrives." That evening, Jack received an unexpected visit from Sarah Mitchell, the reserve's wildlife biologist. Her truck pulled up to his cabin just before sunset. I had to see for myself, she said as she stepped out, her eyes immediately finding Shadow and Scout, who were watching from the porch. Mark told me, but I didn't quite believe it. Jack had worked with Sarah occasionally over the years, but didn't know her well. They're not exactly standard procedure, he acknowledged. Sarah approached slowly, kneeling at a respectful distance from the lynxes. A female Canadian lynx and her male kitten, she said softly. Do you have any idea how rare this is? The population in this region is critically endangered. That's why they're being hunted, Jack said, explaining his discoveries about the griffins and their poaching operation. Sarah's expression grew increasingly troubled as he spoke. This makes sense with what I've been seeing, she said. We've documented a sharp decline in lynx sightings over the past year. I assumed it was natural migration, but illegal hunting explains it better. To Jack's surprise, Shadow approached Sarah cautiously, sniffing the air around her. The biologist remained perfectly still, her breath caught in her throat. She's checking if you're trustworthy, Jack explained, having observed this behavior before. After a moment, Shadow seemed satisfied and retreated to her spot on the porch, allowing Scout to approach for his own investigation. Extraordinary, Sarah whispered. Their behavior is far more socialized than I would have expected for wild lynxes, even accounting for the injury. Jack invited her inside, where he shared the evidence he'd gathered. Santa's expertise provided new insights. The pelts visible in the cabin footage included not just lynx, but other protected species like wolverine and fisher. They're systematically targeting apex predators, she concluded, species that are crucial for ecosystem balance, but have small populations that would take years to recover from hunting pressure, creating ecological imbalance that would support their claim that the reserve is being mismanaged, Jack added. Exactly, Sarah nodded. Eliminate the lynx, and the snowshoe hare population explodes. That affects plant species, which impacts other herbivores. It's a cascade effect that would be obvious in even a cursory ecological survey. As they discussed strategy, Scout suddenly jerked to attention, ears forward, eyes fixed on the window. Shadow, too, became alert, moving silently to the door. Someone's out there, Jack said quietly, dousing the lamp. In the sudden darkness, he reached for his rifle. Sarah froze, following Jack's lead. They listened intently, but the cabin was well insulated against the cold, muffling outside sounds. Scout moved to the window, standing on his hind legs to look out, then dropped back down and returned to Jack, making a soft, chirping sound. "What is it, boy?" Jack whispered. Shadow slipped through the pet door Jack had installed for them, a modification he'd made after realizing the lynxes preferred to patrol the perimeter of the cabin at night. Scout tried to follow, but Jack gently held him back. "Let her check," he told the kitten. "She knows what she's doing." Minutes passed in tense silence. Then Shadow reappeared, looking calm. Whatever had alarmed them had either moved on or posed no immediate threat. "I'm staying tonight," Sarah declared after the tension had passed. "This is too important to leave you without backup." Jack didn't argue. Having another witness strengthened their position, and Sarah's scientific credentials would add weight to their evidence. By morning, they had formulated a plan. Sarah would install official reserve wildlife cameras in strategic locations, creating a legitimate record of the Griffin's activities. Jack would continue his patrols with Shadow and Scout, documenting any new traps or incursions. "The commissioner arrives in 5 days," Sarah said as she prepared to leave. "We need to have an airtight case by then." As she walked to her truck, she paused to look back at the lynxes, who watched her from the porch. "They've bonded with you," she observed. "I've never seen anything like it." "We've been through a lot together," Jack replied simply. After Sarah left, Jack checked his email on the satellite connection. A message from Lisa Chen contained the information he'd been waiting for. Financial records showing a complex web of transactions between Griffin Enterprises and various shell companies, all leading back to North Star Mining. Most damning was a geological survey attached to an internal company email. It detailed significant deposits of rare earth minerals in the mountains just north of the reserve, minerals essential for electronics manufacturing and worth billions. The richest concentration extends under the reserve's northern section, Jack read aloud. The email concluded with a revealing statement. Acquisition of parcels 37 to 42, essential for full extraction potential. Working on regulatory reclassification. The parcels referenced were inside the reserve, the very areas where they'd found the traps and unauthorized cabin. Jack forwarded everything to Mark and Sarah. This was the smoking gun, proof that the Griffins were orchestrating environmental sabotage to force a boundary redrawing of the reserve for mining access. That afternoon, Jack received an urgent call from Mark. Jack, we've got a problem. I just learned that Commissioner Harding has a prior relationship with Richard Griffin. They served on the same energy sector board 5 years ago. And there's more. The state's considering a proposal to optimize the reserve boundaries for economic development opportunities. They're already moving the pieces, Jack realized. How much time do we have? The proposal goes to vote right after the commissioner's inspection tour. If he gives a favorable recommendation, the reserve gets carved up and the Griffins get their mine, Jack finished. We need to move faster. As Jack hung up, he looked at Shadow and Scout, who seemed to sense the gravity of the situation. More than just 2 animals he'd rescued, they had become symbols of everything at stake: the wilderness, the balance of nature, and the fight against greed, disguised as progress. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered forest in shades of amber, the same color as a lynx's watchful eyes. The next 3 days passed in a flurry of activity. Jack, Sarah, and Mark worked tirelessly to build their case against the Griffins. Trail cameras were strategically placed throughout the northeastern section of the reserve. Official reports were filed, documenting each trap and sign of poaching, and the evidence of the mining connection was organized into a compelling presentation. Shadow's wound had healed remarkably well. She still favored the legs slightly, but could now run and jump with almost her former agility. Both lynxes had become an integral part of Jack's daily patrols, their keen senses often alerting him to human presence long before he would have detected it himself. On the morning of the 4th day, Jack received a call from Mark. "Commissioner Harding arrives tomorrow," he said without preamble. He scheduled a preliminary meeting with reserve staff at headquarters, followed by a tour of the northern section, the exact area the Griffins want, Jack noted. Convenient. There's more, Mark continued, his voice tense. Richard Griffin will be accompanying the tour as a local stakeholder. I tried to object, but the commissioner insisted. Jack gripped the phone tighter. They're rushing this. Something's happening that we don't know about. I agree, Mark said, which is why we need to make our move tonight. Sarah's completed her ecological impact assessment. After the call, Jack knelt beside Shadow and Scout, who were lounging near the fireplace. Tonight's the night, he told them, scratching behind Shadow's ears. The culmination of everything we've been working for. The lynxes seemed to understand the gravity in his voice. Shadow's amber eyes held his gaze steadily, while Scout leaned against Jack's knee, a gesture that had become his way of showing support. As dusk approached, Jack prepared his equipment: camera, satellite phone, GPS tracker, and his service pistol, which he hadn't carried since arriving at the reserve. The weapon felt both foreign and familiar in his hand, a reminder of the life he'd left behind. Shadow watched his preparations, her head tilted slightly. When Jack holstered the pistol, she made a soft sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a purr. "Just a precaution," he assured her. "These people are desperate. Desperate people do desperate things." The sound of an approaching vehicle drew Jack to the window. Mark's SUV pulled up, with Sarah in the passenger seat. But as they exited the vehicle, Scout suddenly tensed, his ears flattening against his head. Jack felt it too, a subtle wrongness in the air. He scanned the tree line carefully, noting how the last light of day cast long shadows across the clearing. "Get inside," he called to Mark and Sarah, his voice low but urgent. "Now." They reacted immediately to his tone, hurrying to the cabin. Once inside, Jack locked the door and dimmed the lights. "What is it?" Sarah whispered. "Someone's watching," Jack replied. Scout sensed it first. The young lynx was now at the window, his body language alert, but not alarmed. Shadow moved silently to join him, both animals focused on something outside. "How do you want to play this?" Mark asked, his hand resting on his own sidearm. Jack considered their options. "We proceed as planned, but more carefully. They're likely monitoring the cabin to track our movements. We'll use that." Jack quickly outlined a revised plan. Sarah would leave openly, driving back toward headquarters as a diversion. Meanwhile, Jack and Mark would slip out through the rarely used back door and proceed to the illegal cabin using a circuitous route. "What about them?" Sarah asked, nodding toward the lynxes. Jack hesitated. The safest option was to leave Shadow and Scout in the cabin, but something told him they would be more valuable in the field. "They're coming with us," he decided. "Their senses are sharper than ours." They waited until full darkness before implementing their plan. Sarah departed first, making a show of loading equipment into her vehicle, then driving away with her headlights on full beam. 20 minutes later, Jack and Mark slipped out the back, with Shadow and Scout moving like ghosts ahead of them. The forest at night was a different world. Shadows within shadows, sounds distorted by the cold air. But Jack moved confidently, trusting Shadow's lead. The lynx seemed to instinctively understand their need for stealth, choosing paths that offered both cover and solid footing. After an hour of careful progress, they approached the clearing where the unauthorized cabin stood. A single light burned inside, and 2 vehicles were parked nearby: Thomas Griffin's SUV and an unfamiliar pickup truck. 3 heat signatures inside, Mark whispered, looking through a thermal scope. All stationary, probably sitting around a table. Jack nodded, studying the layout. Their primary objective was to document the interior of the cabin, specifically the illegal animal pelts they had glimpsed through the windows. But with the cabin occupied, their options were limited. Suddenly, Scout stiffened, his attention fixed on something beyond the cabin. Shadow too became alert, her muscles tensing. "Something's wrong," Jack whispered, trusting the lynx's instincts. Before Mark could respond, headlights appeared on the crude access road leading to the cabin, another vehicle approaching. As it drew nearer, Jack recognized it: Sarah's truck. "What is she doing here?" Mark hissed. "She was supposed to create a diversion in the opposite direction." The answer became apparent as the truck pulled up and Sarah emerged, with Richard Griffin right behind her, a hunting rifle pressed against her back. "Out of the vehicle now!" Thomas Griffin's voice called from the cabin doorway, where he now stood with his own weapon raised. "We know you're out there, Forrester. Show yourself, or Dr. Mitchell pays the price." Jack and Mark exchanged grim looks. The situation had deteriorated rapidly, their careful planning undone. "Options?" Mark whispered. "Limited," Jack replied. "They have Sarah, and we're outgunned." He looked at Shadow and Scout, who were watching him intently. "I need you two to stay hidden," he told them softly, "no matter what happens." Shadow seemed to understand, nudging Scout deeper into the underbrush before following him. "Griffin!" Jack called out, rising slowly with his hands visible. "Let her go. This is between us." "Come out where we can see you," Richard Griffin replied, his voice cold and composed. "You too, Chief Ranger Miller." Jack and Mark emerged from the trees, hands raised. Thomas Griffin immediately approached, relieving them of their weapons and phones. "Inside," Richard commanded. Gesturing with his rifle, the interior of the cabin was exactly as Jack had suspected, a poacher's headquarters. Pelts of various animals lined the walls, including several unmistakable lynx hides. Traps and hunting equipment were stacked in one corner, beside crates of ammunition. "Sit," Richard ordered, indicating 3 chairs positioned around a rough wooden table. Once they were seated, Thomas bound their hands with zip ties. "You've been quite the nuisance, Forrester," Richard said, his tone conversational. "Though I must admit, I underestimated your resourcefulness. The lynxes were an unexpected complication." "Is that what this is about?" Jack asked. "Pelts for the black market?" Richard laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "A convenient side business, nothing more. The real prize is what lies beneath this mountain. Rare earth minerals, worth billions, extending right under this worthless reserve." "Worthless?" Sarah challenged, anger overcoming her fear. "This reserve contains one of the most diverse ecosystems in the region, home to dozens of endangered species." "Spare me the environmental lecture, Dr. Mitchell," Richard replied dismissively. "Progress has its price. Species come and go. Extinction is a natural process." "There's nothing natural about what you're doing," Mark said, "and you won't get away with it. Federal authorities already have our evidence." Thomas exchanged a nervous glance with his father, but Richard remained impassive. A setback, perhaps, but not insurmountable, especially when 3 dedicated environmentalists tragically perish in a cabin fire while investigating poaching activities. He nodded to the third man, who had remained silent until now. "Prepare the accelerant." Jack's mind raced, seeking any advantage. They were outnumbered and restrained, their evidence rendered useless if they couldn't deliver it personally. As the third man began pouring gasoline around the cabin's perimeter, Jack caught a glimpse of movement outside the window, a shadow darker than the night, moving with purpose. "You'll never develop this land," Jack said, stalling for time. "Even if we're gone, others will pick up where we left off." "Perhaps," Richard acknowledged, "but delays cost money, and my investors are impatient. The commissioner's visit tomorrow will proceed as planned, and his recommendation will be favorable, especially with the tragic loss of the reserve's most vocal defenders." As Richard spoke, the cabin's single light flickered, then went out, plunging them into darkness. "What the?" Thomas moved toward the door, switching on a flashlight. A bone-chilling screech tore through the night. The hunting cry of a lynx, but amplified, as if multiple animals were calling at once. It was followed by the sound of shattering glass as a window broke on the far side of the cabin. Chaos erupted. The third man shouted in pain and surprise. Taking advantage of the distraction, Jack drove his shoulder into Thomas, knocking him off balance. Mark simultaneously kicked at Richard's legs, sending the older man stumbling. Sarah, whose hands had been bound in front rather than behind, managed to grab a hunting knife from the table and began sawing at her restraints. In the confusion, Shadow launched herself directly at Richard Griffin, not attacking, but creating enough of a distraction for Jack to knock the rifle from his hands. Scout, meanwhile, had somehow targeted the cabin's generator, disconnecting wires and plunging the space into complete darkness, except for the wildly swinging flashlight beam. "Get out!" Jack shouted to Mark and Sarah as soon as his hands were free. Now! They burst through the door into the cold night air, running for the cover of trees. Behind them, angry shouts and the sounds of pursuit followed, but the darkness and their head start gave them an advantage. When they reached the shelter of the forest, Jack turned to see Shadow and Scout racing to join them. Mission accomplished. "I don't know how," Jack said, breathing hard as they continued moving away from the cabin. "But we need to get to headquarters before morning. The commissioner needs to see what's really happening here." The Lynxes led the way through the darkness, their natural night vision guiding the group safely through the forest. Behind them, angry voices faded, but the danger was far from over. As they paused to catch their breath, Jack faced a difficult realization. Whether they succeeded or failed in stopping the Griffins, Shadow and Scout had now revealed themselves. Their unusual behavior and obvious connection to humans would make their return to the wild problematic, and keeping them at his cabin might no longer be an option. Dawn broke over the reserve headquarters, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Jack, Mark, and Sarah had arrived just an hour earlier, exhausted but determined after their night-long journey through the forest. Shadow and Scout had accompanied them the entire way, the Lynx's natural instincts guiding the group through the darkness with unerring precision. Commissioner Harding's black government SUV pulled into the parking lot precisely at 8 a.m. The man who emerged was tall and distinguished, with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Behind him, in a separate vehicle, arrived Richard and Thomas Griffin, looking surprisingly composed despite the night's events. "They're acting as if nothing happened," Sarah whispered, watching through the window of Mark's office. "Because they think we can't prove anything," Jack replied. "The cabin was their word against ours, and they likely cleared out the evidence after we escaped." Mark nodded grimly. "But they don't know about our secret weapon." The weapon he referred to was waiting on a secure server. All the footage from Shadow's harness camera, the trail cameras, and the financial documents from Lisa Chen. Most critically, Sarah's body camera had captured the entire confrontation at the cabin, including Richard Griffin's admission about the mining operation. When the meeting began in the conference room, Jack could feel the tension crackling in the air. The Griffins exuded confidence, clearly believing they had the upper hand. Commissioner Harding opened with standard procedural remarks, outlining the purpose of his visit, a routine assessment of reserve management. "We've heard concerns," he said, nodding toward the Griffins, "about the efficacy of predator protection programs in the reserve, particularly regarding endangered species like the Canadian lynx. That's precisely why we're proposing a revised management approach." Richard Griffin interjected smoothly. "Our family has been stewards of this land for generations, and we believe a public-private partnership would better serve conservation goals." Jack exchanged a glance with Mark, who gave a slight nod. It was time to play their hand. Before we discuss new management proposals, Mark said, we'd like to present some findings from our wildlife monitoring program. He connected his laptop to the projector, and the screen illuminated with footage from Shadow's camera harness. Crystal clear images of the illegal traps, the poacher's cabin, and the stockpiled animal pelts. The commissioner leaned forward, clearly surprised. "What am I looking at?" "Systematic poaching of protected species," Sarah explained, "occurring primarily in the northeast sector of the reserve, adjacent to Griffin property." Richard Griffin's composed facade cracked slightly. "This proves nothing. Wildlife cameras can be manipulated." "These aren't standard wildlife cameras," Jack interrupted, standing up. "This footage comes from a camera mounted on a living lynx, a female who was injured in one of your traps." The revelation brought a moment of stunned silence to the room. "That's unconventional methodology," Commissioner Harding said carefully. "Necessitated by unconventional circumstances," Mark replied, advancing to the next piece of evidence: the geological surveys and financial documents linking Griffin Enterprises to North Star Mining. "This is outrageous," Thomas Griffin exploded, rising to his feet. "Private business documents obtained illegally." "Through legal channels," Jack corrected, "by federal authorities investigating corporate fraud." This was a careful stretching of the truth. Lisa Chen had accessed the documents through her financial crimes investigation, though the focus hadn't initially been the Griffins. But the bluff worked. Thomas hesitated, clearly uncertain how much the authorities really knew. Commissioner Harding studied the documents with growing concern. "These surveys indicate substantial mineral deposits extending under reserve land. The real reason behind their sudden interest in conservation partnerships," Sarah explained, "access to rare earth minerals worth billions." Richard Griffin had recovered his composure, his expression hardening. "Commissioner, this is clearly a fabricated narrative by staff members desperate to maintain the status quo. I suggest we proceed with our scheduled tour, where you can see the actual conditions on the ground." "Indeed," Commissioner Harding agreed, but his tone had changed. "I think a first-hand look is exactly what's needed." What followed was a carefully orchestrated tour of the northeastern section of the reserve. At Jack's insistence, they used reserve vehicles rather than the Griffins, and they followed a route that included all the locations where traps had been documented. At each site, Sarah provided ecological context, while Jack explained how the lynxes had helped identify poaching activities. "These lynxes," the commissioner asked, as they stood at a trap site, "where are they now?" Jack hesitated. Shadow and Scout had remained at headquarters, safely secured in Mark's office. "They're recovering at our facility," he answered carefully. "I'd like to see them," Harding said, unexpectedly. "If they've been instrumental in uncovering this situation, I should include them in my report." Back at headquarters, Jack led the commissioner to the office where Shadow and Scout waited. He had been concerned about how the lynxes would react to strangers after their ordeal, but he needn't have worried. Both animals were alert but calm, watching the proceedings with intelligent eyes. "Remarkable," Commissioner Harding murmured, observing the lynx's behavior. "And you say the mother was injured in a trap?" "Yes," Jack confirmed. "Her leg was severely damaged. She found her way to my cabin during a blizzard, with her kitten following. I provided emergency care, and a bond formed." Harding nodded thoughtfully. "And what happens to them now?" The question Jack had been dreading. Protocol was clear. Wild animals, once recovered, were to be released back into their natural habitat, or if unable to survive in the wild, transferred to proper wildlife rehabilitation facilities. "That's something we need to discuss," Mark interjected, sensing Jack's hesitation. "These lynxes represent a special case. Their behavior has been unprecedented." The commissioner studied Shadow and Scout for a long moment. "In my 30 years of conservation work, I've learned that exceptions sometimes prove more valuable than rules. These animals have clearly developed a unique relationship with Ranger Forrester." The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Federal agents arrived to interview the griffins, whose confident demeanor had crumbled in the face of mounting evidence. Commissioner Harding worked with Mark to draft emergency protections for the northeastern section of the reserve, specifically citing the lynx habitat as critical for preservation. By evening, the griffins had departed under escort, facing multiple federal charges, including environmental crimes, attempted murder, and corporate fraud related to the mining scheme. Jack finally returned to his cabin late that night, accompanied by Shadow and Scout. The lynxes immediately set about inspecting their territory, ensuring everything was as they had left it. Jack watched them with mixed emotions, pride in what they had accomplished together, but uncertainty about the future. The next morning brought Commissioner Harding to his door, along with Sarah and Mark. "I've been thinking about your situation," Harding said as they settled in the cabin's small living area. Shadow and Scout observed from their favored spot near the fireplace. "These lynxes," the commissioner continued, "represent something unique, a case study in interspecies cooperation that could inform conservation efforts nationwide." "What are you suggesting?" Jack asked cautiously. "A pilot program," Harding replied. "The Blue Ridge Wildlife Monitoring Initiative. Using your experience as a model, we would develop protocols for rehabilitation and training of injured predators, with the goal of monitoring remote wilderness areas where human presence is disruptive." Sarah leaned forward excitedly. "We could document Shadow and Scout's behavior, their adaptation to human interaction, while maintaining wild instincts. Nothing like this has been studied in a controlled environment." "And Jack," Mark asked, "what would his role be?" "Project lead," Harding said simply. "Living here, continuing his work as a ranger, but with the additional responsibility of developing the program. With appropriate resources, of course." Jack looked at Shadow and Scout, who seemed to be following the conversation. "What about them? They're wild animals. They should have the freedom to choose." "That's precisely what makes this program revolutionary," Harding replied. "They would have that freedom. This cabin would be their home base, but they'd be free to come and go, to live as wild lynxes do, while maintaining their connection to you." The proposal was unprecedented, but logical. It balanced the realities of the situation: Shadow and Scout's unusual socialization, the conservation needs of the reserve, and Jack's unique ability to bridge the gap between human and wild worlds. Over the next 6 months, the Blue Ridge Wildlife Monitoring Initiative took shape. Jack's cabin was expanded to include a small research facility, where Sarah could document the lynx's behavior and health. Shadow's leg healed completely, leaving only a slight stiffness that did nothing to impair her hunting abilities. Scout grew rapidly, developing into a handsome young male with his mother's intelligence and a fearlessness born of his unusual upbringing. As spring turned to summer, Shadow began to range farther from the cabin, sometimes disappearing for days at a time. But she always returned, often bringing Scout with her. The young lynx, now nearly adult-sized, showed less inclination to wander, preferring to divide his time between the wild forest and Jack's company. The data they collected proved invaluable. Shadow's camera harness, redesigned for comfort and durability, captured unprecedented footage of Lynx behavior in the wild. Scout, fitted with a similar device once he was full-grown, provided complementary data from a male perspective. 1 year after the confrontation with the Griffins, Jack stood on his porch, watching Shadow emerge from the forest. Behind her followed not only Scout, now a magnificent adult lynx, but 2 small spotted kittens, Scout's offspring from a mate he had found in the wild. "Well, look at that," Jack said softly as the lynx family approached. "Grandchildren." Shadow led her grandkittens confidently up the porch steps, presenting them to Jack as if for approval. The kittens regarded the human with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Wild, as they should be, but without fear. Sarah, who had arrived for her weekly observations, watched in amazement. "She's introducing them to you," she whispered, "bringing generations together." The Blue Ridge Wildlife Monitoring Initiative had exceeded all expectations. Not only had it provided groundbreaking research on lynx behavior, but it had also become a model for conservation programs nationwide. Jack had presented their findings at conferences, always emphasizing that the success came from respecting the animal's wild nature while building mutual trust. The Griffins' mining scheme had been thoroughly dismantled, their lands adjacent to the reserve purchased by a conservation trust. The northeastern section that had been targeted was now designated as critical habitat, with expanded protections. As Jack crouched to greet the lynx family, he reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From a wounded wild animal on his porch during a blizzard to this unprecedented blending of worlds. Shadow was still wild, free to follow her instincts, yet she had chosen to include Jack in her family circle. "Welcome home," he told them softly, as Scout's kittens cautiously sniffed his outstretched hand. In Shadow's amber eyes, Jack saw the same intelligence and trust that had been there that first night, but now without pain or fear. She had found her place in this unusual arrangement, neither fully wild nor domesticated, but something new and valuable. A bridge between 2 worlds, just as Jack himself had become.